so trauma overview. This is going to talk about different aspects that go into our scene size up. We have a big term that we're going to keep coming back to in this chapter called index of suspicion. So based on what we see when we come on the scene, how bad the mechanism of injury is will kind of change our index of suspicion when it comes to how critically the patient could be injured. Guys, trauma, it doesn't discriminate, right? You're not going to see, like we did with the medical chapter, patients who are certain ethnicities, certain genders are more predisposed to different medical problems, not with trauma, all right? So just by happenstance, any age group, any gender, any ethnicity, we're going to see trauma all across the board when it comes to these calls you're going to run. So here's the definition of index of suspicion. What do you guys think that means?
Based on your observations, right?
And concern, potentially serious underlying and unseen injuries.
All right, so that means if I come on scene to an MVC, what does that stand for? Motor vehicle crash, motor vehicle collision. You also might hear it referred to as an MVA, motor vehicle accident. If I come on scene to an MVC and it's just two cars involved and it's just a small fender bender, do you think I have a very high index of suspicion when it comes to my patient's injuries or potential injuries? No, not really. I'm going to have a low index of suspicion when it comes to that scene. If I come on scene and this is a rollover crash on 285, before I even, touch eyes on my patient, do you think my index of suspicion is going to be much higher based on the damage to the car, the fact that it was a rollover? I'm going to have a much higher index of suspicion that my patient's got some serious injuries going on, okay? Index of suspicion can be a little sneaky sometimes, right? You guys ever seen maybe the scene of a really bad crash, or maybe seen it on the news, or, personally related to it, the car was jacked up, but the person walked away without a scratch? You guys ever heard of that or seen that?
Yeah.
Okay. We need to be highly suspicious still that even though we might not see anything externally on our patient, what could potentially be going on? Internal injuries. All right. So we're going to get all of these factors that go in to say, oh, hey, I see this on the scene. This could lead to some significant injuries. I might not physically see anything externally on my patient, but if our index of suspicion is high for internal injuries, that's going to fuel what if the patient wants to refuse? Huh? If I have a high index of suspicion, but my patient's wanting to refuse, I don't see anything externally wrong with the patient, what do I need to make sure I do? Everything I can to try to persuade that patient to go get checked out, right? I don't have a CT scanner. I can't do ultrasounds. You could have some internal injuries that I can't physically see. Dude, look at your car. It's jacked up. You need to go get checked out head to toe, right? So that's going to go into if the patient wants to refuse. We're going to really push and urge them to go to the hospital, and we're definitely going to make that a what kind of refusal? An AMA if we have a high index of suspicion. Is everybody on board with the definition and how it plays into what we're doing? Okay. So mechanism of injury, what does this mean? Because remember we talked about NOI is related to what? Medical, nature of illness. MOI is trauma. So that stands for, which pretty much means what?
What did the bad things to them?
What happened? How did my patient break their bone? Did they fall off a building? Did they, trip over a sidewalk? Were they involved in MVC? So that's the MOI is going to be what happens to make my patient sustain these injuries. Okay. All right, guys, we're not going to go so much back to like high school, physical science, but we do need to understand a couple different terms when it comes to, science and how it goes into our MOI and our suspicion, our index of suspicion. All right, potential energy is what?
Sounds like
Energy loss.
Okay, so energy at rest, right? We're concerned with potential energy. What goes into that factor? Like if I'm looking at a scene, what kind of like potential energy do I keep in
Somebody
mind?
was working at night and they fall from that.
Okay, so maybe like the height that somebody was at if they fell. Maybe this. No, that's technically an motion.
And the car sure is like teetering over the edge of the bridge.
Okay, so maybe like the size and the weight of the vehicle, if it's pertaining to that, those different type things, but I'm really concerned about that kinetic energy. What is that? Energy in motion. How fast was the car going? The potential energy too, if they hit a stationary object, what was a stationary object? All right, so that's going to factor in. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Guys, this is the biggest thing to take away from this science aspect. What is that? What does that say?
You can't be created or destroyed. If they had a lot of kinetic energy and they got into a car crash, all that energy went somewhere, mostly into the smashing things.
Okay. Energy can't be created or destroyed. It's only transferred, right? So that car that was going 85 miles an hour that hit that concrete wall, all of that energy didn't just stop the second that it hit the wall. It was transferred, particularly where?
Into the car.
Into the car, into my patient's body, into that object, right? So that's why usually like speed of the vehicle, if it's an MVC, if they hit an object, what that object was, those are really big things to keep in mind because that's going to have a direct effect on how my patient's body was impacted. Don't worry about this stuff. Just understand the definition of potential kinetic energy, all right? It can factor in to your patient's MOI and your index of suspicion, but the energy being transferred, not created or destroyed, it's only transferred. That's the biggest thing to take away. All right, so significant versus insignificant. Whoops. All right, non-significant or insignificant. Give me an example of a non-significant MOI. A scrape. Okay, so maybe somebody just like fell off of the sidewalk and just landed on the ground. Okay, a ground level fall usually is labeled as non-significant or insignificant. We'll talk about that a little later, how it can be bad. What else?
First degree burn.
Okay, first degree burn. It's very superficial, right? It's not getting deep down into the tissue. I'm not really concerned with first degree burn. I stubbed my toe on I stubbed my pinky toe on the coffee table. Okay, probably not going to die from that. Maybe unless you're a hemophiliac, you might, but probably not the case, right? Significant injuries, falls from significant heights. Here at Grady specifically, we have a higher level triage if it is a patient who falls from more than double their body height. All right, so for me, if I fell from a 10-foot, 10-inch surface or height, Grady would say, ooh, that's bad. You could have significant injuries. That's going to be a code 1 response. Versus a ground level fall. What does that mean? Ground level fall. You fall from your height. If I'm walking and I trip over this cord and I fall down to the ground from the height of my body, it's usually not a significant potential for injury. Can be, but from significant heights, falls can be very bad. MVCs, multi-system trauma, what do you think that means? Okay, so more than one system is affected. Usually when you think of trauma, you think of what system or what body parts?
Like your head and some in the chest.
Usually most people think of like skin and bones, right? But it's very possible to have the heart involved, the lungs involved, any of the organs in the abdominal cavity, the brain, all right? So if we've got a lot of different organs and systems involved, that is multi-system trauma. That's not good. Getting hit by a car, if you're walking on the street or on a bike, that's not good. GSWs, stabbings, all right, there's a lot that can go wrong there. So we have 2 types of trauma, 2 categories of trauma, blunt and penetrating. What do you think blunt trauma means? So you can get hit by something, but it's classified as blunt trauma if what? If the skin is not broken, like significantly broken. Okay. Give me an example of blunt trauma. I'll see if you guys have the example that every single class gives me. Getting hit in the chest by a baseball bat. Every single time. the example everyone comes up with, but that is blunt trauma. If I don't crack open the skin and open up my, my thoracic cavity to the outside world from that base swing of the hit of the baseball bat, that's blunt trauma. What's penetrating trauma? When the skin is significantly broken, okay? So, okay, you got maybe like a Walking Dead situation. What's the bat's name? Nobody watches Lucille. Nobody watches Walking Dead? Or
No,
watch
not anymore.
Walking Dead?
Trash.
If there's like barbed wire wrapped around the baseball bat, that could be both blunt and penetrating, right? A GSW, what does that stand for? Gunshot wound, a stabbing. If you fall on something and you, like that object like impales your body, penetrating trauma, okay? So with blunt trauma, are we typically gonna see a ton of external injuries when it comes to blunt trauma? Not really by the definition of what it is, right? Usually the skin's not significantly broken. We're not gonna see like bones sticking out. We're not gonna see blood exiting the body if the skin is intact. So what's our biggest concern why we would have an index of suspicion for any kind of blunt trauma? Internal injuries, particularly internal bleeding. Okay, so somebody could get hit in the chest with a baseball bat, their skin's intact, but what if they have something going on with their heart or their lungs? Can I physically see that on the inside?
No.
No. I can maybe see some signs that's telling me, hey, this is possibly going on internally, but I can't see it with my eyes, right? So we're gonna have a higher index of suspicion for blunt trauma injuries, particularly pertaining to internal bleeding. Okay, guys, now we're gonna start going back to that acronym, DCAT BTLS. Right, what are some things that I might find? Let's say somebody gets hit in the gut with a baseball bat, skin's not broken. If I'm palpating the abdomen and I see certain things, what's gonna raise a red flag to say, ooh, we might have some bleeding going on there. Okay, so maybe rigidity, because that means what? Super, super firm to the touch, and that means that there's a significant amount of blood pooling and accumulating in that abdominal cavity to cause that firmness. What else? Distension. Okay, so again, if it's that much blood accumulating, it's going to start kind of poking out, and we're going to see that localized, usually swelling.
Losing or darting right over a major organ.
Okay, so maybe contusions or discoloration over that particular area, guarding if the patient's conscious or incoherent. Say, ow, that hurts. Because guys, what is the definition of a contusion? We're gonna get to this in soft tissue, but it's a bruise. What happens with bruises?
Internal bleeding.
It changed colors.
Well,
Minor internal bleeding.
how did bruises happen? How did this happen? I broke the capillary beds in my nail bed. That's what causes that release of the blood. It's right up against the surface of the skin. That's what causes that discoloration, is we disrupt those capillary beds. All right. So it could mean that it's a superficial injury, or the presentation of that discoloration. It doesn't necessarily always mean that the capillaries are broken and bursted. It could mean that there's blood pooling from the inside that's pushing up against the skin. We get a little bit more in soft tissue, but we're going to look for that as well. Everybody with me so far? All right, MVCs, guys, we're going to talk about this a lot. Are we going to see a lot of this in Atlanta?
Yes.
Why?
35.
People can't
Okay,
drive.
285, 85, 75, 420. Am I missing any?
Basically, all the major highways.
78. Is it 116? 316? That goes to Athens. What is it? 166. All right, we had a lot of major highways around Atlanta. All right, we do have MVCs that occur on, the inner city streets, but does anyone ever drive the speed limit on the highway?
No.
No.
No, you don't, Sean. Because guys, what's the official speed limit anyway? 5 over, right? At least. If you're on like a city street.
Yeah.
I mean, at least, but the interstate. I'm not gonna admit any of this on camera, but nobody drives. So keep in mind, if you get a super speeder ticket, you do contribute to the trauma fund.
Yes. And
Or
you have to
gravy.
show up for court, others the other bunch weren't.
Yeah. Oh. So her friend told her. And they're hella expensive, but all that money goes to the trauma foundation. So Grady thanks you if you get a super speeder. But guys, there's a lot of different types of NVCs. The different types can mean different injuries, can cause higher or lower indexes of suspicion when it comes to these injuries. A front end collision. All right, guys, what am I worried about this type of NVC?
Right, the driver has to get ejected through the windshield.
Okay, so yeah, definitely. I want to know, again, that energy is not created nor destroyed, it's only transferred. If I've got the weight of my patient and the weight of my car and how fast that car's moving, did it hit a stationary object? Did it hit another car? What was the direction that it was moving? All of that stuff goes into, does my patient have the potential to become ejected from the car? That means what?
They're no longer in the car.
They're no longer in the car. They get thrown out of the vehicle. Good or bad?
Very bad.
Not good. All right, so yeah, definitely front end collisions. I'm concerned that particularly through this windshield, if my patient or my passenger or passengers were not restrained, I have high potential to be ejected if we hit something stationary like this. Rear end, what is that concern? What's my biggest concern with rear end collisions? Whiplash, right? Hey guys, I'm not talking about a paint exchange. Rear end collision. What does that mean? A paint exchange. Like, there's no cosmetic damage, there's no structural damage, only maybe like, the scuff of paint. Not really concerned about significant injuries when it comes to that type of rear end collision. All right, but if I think there's not a picture. No. Okay, something that significant, that's the rear end of a vehicle. Yeah, my index of suspicion is raised. All right, particularly for this type of injury. What is this called? I know, it starts with C. It can lead to a concussion. It's an alliterative word. Coupe contra coupe, or coupe counter coupe. So what's happening here? Even if you are restrained, even if you're wearing your seatbelt, okay, if you get rear-ended, we do have that whiplash effect. If it is significant, if that car is going super fast, if you're stopped, suddenly on 285 and you see somebody coming behind you at highway speeds, they don't see you and they slam into the back of your car. That's significant. What am I worried about? What happens here?
Impact of head.
So what happens during whiplash? You get thrusted forward,
Yank back.
right? And then if you're wearing your seatbelt, which everyone should wear your effing seatbelt. If I ever see any of you guys driving without a seatbelt, I'm going to shame you to no end. And I promise if you don't wear your seatbelt now, when you get out there and you have a bad MBC and you're picking up brain matter off the side of 75, you'll change your tune. Okay, please wear your seatbelt. It's so stupid not to. And I don't have any problem. Oh, the face?
Saw it, yeah.
Mhm. Wear your seatbelt. All right, so if we get struck from behind, if you're wearing your seatbelt, you're going to get thrown forward, and that whole energy being transferred thing, what happens when that motion comes to a stop? You get yanked back again. All right, so fun fact, your headrest on the seat of your car is essential for trying to avoid significant neck injuries. You always want to make sure your headrest sits literally right here. It's not higher, it's not lower. If you're one of those people who removes your headrests from your seat because you think it looks cool, you're gonna probably be paralyzed, if not dead, if you have a significant rear end collision. All right, it's made to, when we get thrusted forward, it's made to catch your head if you have that whiplash effect when it comes back. So make sure, adjust your headrest accordingly. But yeah, so we have this injury that is potential with significant whiplash called coupe contra coupe, okay? C-O-U-P, C-O-N-T,
Okay, so
R-E?
I was like.
I think it's from French. I don't know. I'm not a language person. But yeah, so when we go forward, if our head hits the windshield, or even if it's from a significant speed, what's happening to our brain as my head's doing this?
It's still in motion.
All right, so that frontal lobe of my brain is going to hit the frontal aspect of my skull, and then when I go back, that occipital hits the occipital. All right, so we have potential for kind of like a double doozy brain injury if we have a significant rear end collision. All right, so again, higher index of suspicion if we have significant structural damage to the car itself. Let's see, lateral collisions. Dun, 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 dun. What is this? What are lateral collisions? T-bone. All right. Good or bad? Usually bad. Okay. There's a very common, especially if it's on the, my stepdad used to joke to me all the time, like if he would make a turn and he was like kind of cutting it close, he'd be like, oh, it's okay, you're on the blood side anyway. Like if the car was coming on from like the pass, it would impact the passenger side of the car. And it's like, you're on the blood side, it's fine. Obviously. Depending on if my patient was directly on that side that got T-boned, a very common cause of almost instantaneous death from this is going to be what? Anybody know? So you're on the right mind track. So think about the position of your body. If you're driving forward, most all the times we see this, somebody's going through a red light, somebody runs a red light, right? And you're in the middle of the intersection and somebody says, T-bones you right here. How's your body going to go?
It's going to go to the side.
We see a lot of aortic shearing, just based on the way that your body gets flung. If that car was going significantly fast, that type of thing, we see a lot of aortic shearing with T-bone or lateral impacts. Rollover crashes. What are these are bad, right? What's happening here? You're literally rolling the car, okay? What are some things, we're gonna go back to one of these pictures and talk about all the things that need to be going through our head for this scene size up for MVCs. But particularly with a rollover, what are some things that I'm thinking about that could have caused injury or raise my index of suspicion even higher? How many times did it roll? Right? Is it just one of those weird things where they got maybe T-boned or like hit at the tail end and it just kind of like rolled over once and it just laid on its side and it wasn't really like a pancake roll, you know what I mean? How many times did it roll over? All right, this is something that we want to utilize witnesses for. If there's a bystander on scene, or if your patient's conscious and remembers what happened, hey, how many times did you see the car flip? Because is half of a flip better or worse than 3 times? Better, right?
I was at a stoplight one day and the lady was making the right hand turn and she fell asleep at the wheel. And so she came into people going straight and she went up, turned over and fell down. And she was taken away to a stretcher and then the other car broke both of her arms.
Mm-hmm.
That was.
And we'll talk about that a little bit. Why that probably happened. What else is cause for concern for a rollover? What can happen? Okay, did my patient become ejected during a rollover? If they weren't wearing their seatbelt and they got ejected, ejection's not good in any capacity, but particularly more so in a rollover. Why?
So there's too many ways that they could get ejected out of there.
So what happens if your patient gets ejected and the car's still rolling?
Or might roll on top.
Your body
Or
could
might
be
roll on
flung
top of the
somewhere.
patient. What else can happen here?
It could actually come out the car, go back in the car, come out the car, go back in the car.
So possibly, all right, even if your patient's restrained, you have seatbelts for your arms.
No.
Okay, what if the windows get busted out and your arm gets flung out?
But then probably don't have an arm anymore.
We worry about partial amputations when it comes to rollovers. Even if you're restrained, if your arm gets flung out that window and the car rolls the wrong way and your arm's outside of the car, it's possible you could have a partial amputation or a complete amputation of the arm. Okay, what else?
Make sure that passenger compartment's intact.
Okay, we'll get there. Yes, we'll get there with that other picture. But particularly in rollovers, a lot of people don't think about this.
Objects in the
About-
vehicle collide the driver.
Guys, everything in your car, whether it's a person who's unrestrained, whether it's your heavy ass textbook, or if you're an avid bowler, you have a bowling ball, I don't know, in your car, or anything that is of substantial weight becomes a flying missile during a rollover. Okay? A lot of time this is what included? People, yes. Also, pets. Yeah. Okay, people don't think about that, guys. One of the first calls that really effed me up when I first started working here, it was right after Christmas time. Dude was loaded down with presents, going back home. He had come in town to visit his family. There, where was it? It was on 85 North. Had something happen. He went to slam on his brakes. He went to turn away from it, and his Jeep rolled twice. He had a dog in the car. Dog was not restrained. Dog was ejected. Dude was fine. He didn't have a scratch on him, but the dog was actively having seizures on the scene because it had a brain bleed because it got ejected. Can we treat animals? No. So me and my partner are like, hey dude, are you good? Like, refusal, AMA, whatever. Or like, we have to like get off the scene because we literally had to like sit there and watch the dog die. And the dude was watching his dog die. So yeah, animals are a big one. So just keep that in mind. Anything inside of the car, if it's not restrained, it can go flying around, hit your patient in the head, raises your index of suspicion for sure. Okay. Sunroofs and moonroofs are also another potential hazard if anything goes flying out the top. Okay, that's why insurance, if you are trying to buy a new car, your car insurance company will say, does it have a moonroof or a sunroof? And if it does, they charge you a little bit more to insure it because there are more hazards to having a sunroof and a moonroof. Okay. I think the moonroof it goes all the way.
No, a sunroof, no, because maybe a moonroof won't. The moonroof is crack it open, or it's just glass.
The moonroof is longer. You can see the moon, and the sunroof, you can only see the sun.
There you go. But that creates structural compromise to the top roof of that car, regardless of if it can open or not, because it's not just a continuous sheet of aluminum or whatever the car is made out of. Huh? So just some things to keep in mind, especially when it comes to rollovers. What about rotational crashes? What is this? When you kind of spin out of control. We see this a lot when it's icy on the roads, when people hydroplane. The wheels, the tires lose that traction, and you just kind of like spin or kind of fishtail, okay? There's not a whole lot of control of the car when this happens, so typically we see what end result with a rotational crash. Another collision, a secondary collision, right? The car usually like runs into a telephone pole or a tree or another car, so. All right. Touched on that. So let's talk about, where did I pass? No, here we go. Let's talk about different things we need to be thinking of mentally when we come on scene to an NVC. If this is your crash, this is your call, you come on scene and you see this. What are some things that are going through your mind that are going to affect your patient's injuries or overall criticality?
The door is down.
Where's my door?
Seats further.
Right? Okay, so let's start with that. Where's the door?
What happened to it to make it not be there anymore?
It's on the ground.
So with this, all right, so guys, this is typically this is called the A-frame or the A-post right here that holds like the kind of diagonal that attaches the windshield to the car. And then your B-post is typically right here. So A-post and B-post. All right, B-post is totally gone. Probably what happened here.
Front left.
Notice there's not a patient in here, so this is after the patient's gone.
Front left part of the vehicle smashed into something really heavy.
So fire got to use their tools, their toys.
They got to cut stuff.
Okay, this patient was cut out of the vehicle.
Looks like the collision is worse than the passenger side. I mean, crumpling of the hood.
All right, so that's another thing, guys. If your patient has to be extricated, all right, what's the definition of extricated? So your patient cannot physically remove themselves from whatever environment they're in. All right, we see this most of the time in vehicle crashes and MVCs. All right, it might be a jacked up car like this where they can't physically open the door or they can't physically get themselves out. If we have to ourselves physically take them out of the car or the surrounding environment, that is called that they need to be extricated or extrication. Okay. You'll also hear the term entrapped. What does that mean? They're stuck. So, rollover MVC with possible entrapment. That means that there's still a patient in the car and for whatever reason they cannot get out. If we come on scene, if fire comes on scene, cuts them out, drags them out, that means that they were extricated from the car. Okay. What are some things that need to go into our thought about if the patient does need to be extricated? How long did it take for fire to come on scene, cut that B post off, and get to the point where they could get the patient out of the vehicle? Why does that matter?
Because all that time they were not getting any care.
The entire time they were in the process of being extricated, they weren't getting efficient, treatment. Guys, if you come on scene before fire cut this off, if that B post was intact, do you think that in any capacity you could try to do like maybe some bleeding control or maybe bag your patient if they're in that bad of an environment?
Ew.
All right, so that is something that if your patient has to be extricated, you need to take a mental time stamp and say how long it took them to be extricated because the hospital wants to know that. Right, so if you have an extrication, you need to keep track of how long it took because again, that's how long that patient's going without getting sufficient patient care. All right, if we have to, there's been several times where fire has to cut this B post, the back of the vehicle's in good shape, and you can get in the passenger seat, the rear passenger seat, and maybe bag your patient from there, or hold C-spine from the back of the car, or do any type of treatment. But you also have to keep one in mind. We're seeing safety, right? So if they're needing to be extricated, that means the car was jacked up enough, or they were physically injured to the point where they couldn't get themselves out. Right? Yes.
So with that kind of situation, we want to be mindful of all of their limbs because it kind of leads to once they remove things, then all their blood pressure comes back and it's like.
We'll talk about that. But yes, that is something we do need to keep in mind. Okay, guys, fire gets so excited when they get to use their toys. Okay, are we really involved in that extrication process?
Not really.
Because of what? Why?
Trying to use this.
It's not our equipment. We're not trained how to use it. And I guarantee you guys, it is massive, heavy machinery. If you even attempted to try to use any of that, you would cut your own toe off. And we also don't have what? Protective gear. Guys, they wear their turnout gear when they extricate a patient. They wear their helmets. They wear their face shield when they extricate patients, because what can happen?
You're cutting metal. Little
Things
things.
go flying, glass goes flying, you're cutting metal, it gets very hot, it gets very sharp, right? Our uniforms don't protect us from any of that, okay? Yes, sir.
What are the paramedics for? What do y'all get excited to use?
Decompression needles, ET tubes. But yeah, so we're not really involved in the actual extrication process. What do you need to make sure that you're doing while this is happening? Okay, so coming up with a plan, right? There's going to be probably about 6 firefighters sworn on this card to be involved in this extrication process. Typically, if it's an MVC this bad, more than one engine will respond. So there's probably going to be some firefighters that are hanging out, not really doing an active part of extrication. Let's talk to those firefighters. Let's communicate with who's actually extricating and say, hey, when you get to the point where we're getting ready to get them out, hey, let's get this backboard in here. Let's get this stretcher here. So we're not actively cutting them out of the car, but we're saying, hey, let's make this as smooth as possible once we get them to that point.
Pretty typical that through that extrication process, you have stuff flying at your patient.
Oh yeah, they typically will place a sheet and put it over the patient just to protect them from glass flying. Do what?
Is that effective?
Most of the time. Most of the time. But make sure we're being a what throughout this whole process. We're being what for the patient? An advocate. Guys, if you see fire just totally doing something that's directly causing harm to your patient, or they're doing something that is just, tread lightly with this, right? Because we don't have the training, we don't have the experience of cutting people out of the car. They might be doing something because they know it's not going to work any other way. But you need to be a patient advocate. Be like, hey, fire, make sure, hey, watch this. If you have fire and they're holding C-spine, make sure they're doing it correctly. If fire's in their bagging your patient or whatever it is, be mindful of the care that's being provided to your patient and speak up if something's going to directly cause harm to your patient or it's not being done correctly.
Yeah,
Right.
it is.
Sometimes. Because I've not been like put in my place, but I was concerned about how they were going about cutting the patient out of the car, and they're like, dude, there's literally no other way we can do it. So again, I don't have the training, I don't have the knowledge. I'm not trying to tell them how to do their job, because they get really excited about this. So sometimes they get tunnel vision, they might not realize that something could cause harm to the patient. Okay. What else am I looking at this scene in particular, and any MVC? What else do I want to notice and mentally note?
The airbag fire.
Airbags. Guys, airbags are a big, big component to your index of suspicion and your MOI. Why?
Because they can cause just as much damage as anything else.
Nowadays they're a little more sensitive, but
Especially on older cars, they used to only fire if it was a bad crash.
if airbags are deployed, that means that there was a moderate to significant force to the car, right? Where do we see airbags here?
In the
Steering
front,
wheel, probably. I can't tell if that's the curb or if the dashboard over there has it. What do we need to keep in mind about newer cars?
Side curtain airbags.
There should be airbags everywhere in newer
Literally-
cars, right? They
literally
should come out of
front
the steering
and
wheel. They should come
side.
out of the dashboard. They should come out of the, what is it called, window curtain airbags,
Side curtain.
side curtain airbags. They should come out of both sides of the driver and the passenger door. There's even some cars where it separates the
Yeah.
front of the vehicle from the back of the vehicle. There's rear airbags everywhere, right?
They're
great.
basically a
What do
bubble.
we, make sure that what are they designed to do?
Cushion impact.
Okay, cushion impact. Okay, specifically, guys, this one's really important, right? Prevents your body from being flung into that stationary parts of the car. Okay, so serve as kind of like a buffer to prevent significant injuries.
They still cause bone breakage.
But they are still very forceful, guys. The weight, has anybody been in NBC where airbags were deployed?
Nope.
They're brutal. They come out instantaneously and very forcefully.
It's an actual explosive.
Yes, it is. All right, so that is the mechanism of how they come out. It is a very subdued explosion, if you will, to have them puff up that quick and that forcefully. So they're great when they prevent injuries, but sometimes they can also cause injuries. Usually the minor injuries we see from airbags are what?
Bruising.
So maybe some skin, like maybe some abrasions, right? Because what's an abrasion? Not a burn.
Great.
Kind of like just that very top layer. So you can equivalent it to it like maybe like carpet burn or road rash, right? It's not like a cut, but that top superficial layer of your skin is affected. What else do we see a lot with? So maybe fingers, because that's a new thing, guys. When I was gone those 2 days, going to that class, I forgot. What's the old, and you guys probably going through driving classes, and when you got taught how to drive, what's your hand placement on the steering wheel?
10 and 2.
10 and 2, right? Keep your hands on 10 and 2. That's being changed. Why? What's it being changed to? 9 and 3. Okay, with all of these high-tech steering wheel airbags, when they get deployed, what can happen with your arms? They can either fling back on yourself or they fling out this way. If they're at 9 and 3, they don't really get redistributed as negatively. All right, so maybe some broken fingers if their hands are, especially if you're like driving like this. What else? What else is a big one?
There's chemicals on airbags.
Yes. All right, so skin irritation from the residue, that very subdued explosion. There's chemicals that cause that reaction to happen. They can get on the skin, they can get in the eyes. They can irritate the skin, they can irritate the eyes. They can also trigger what?
Anaphylaxis.
Maybe anaphylaxis, asthma attacks sometimes. All right, so keep that in mind. I always forget to put this picture in. Have you guys seen it? It's on the internet. It's this one chick, she was wearing a crap ton of makeup and the airbag went off and her head like totally went in the airbag, and it was a perfect imprint of her makeup on her face. On the airbag, you could see like her mouth was open. She was like, I guess screaming, but you can see like the perfect lipstick line and all of her foundation and her mascara and stuff. Yeah, it was, I put that in there, right? So, yeah. What else am I looking? Oh, okay. So what if I come on scene and I don't see airbag deployed? What if I see this car and there's no airbags deployed?
We're just gonna deploy when I get it.
Guys, that's a scene safety issue. Big time. All right. There, a few years ago, there was a firefighter who was killed because of this. They got on scene. They were trying to gain access to the patient. The airbags had not deployed. They had faulty airbags. And the movement of them trying to get the patient out of the car caused the airbag to deploy. The position that the firefighter was in, it broke his neck. So if you come on scene, something that's this significant and the airbags aren't deployed, you don't need to try to access your patient. Right? The only way that they can have usually 100% confirmation that these airbags aren't going to be faulty and deploy incorrectly is cutting the battery. All right. So A, scene safety, number one, absolutely, because it can cause harm to you. And then B, what else am I concerned with if I don't see these airbags deployed?
Worse injuries per patient.
Yeah, my patient, right? They didn't have that buffer in between the steering wheel or the dashboard or the B post if it was a side curtain airbags. Okay, but make sure that you remember that for your scene safety. What else am I looking at here when I come on scene? Maybe not in this car particularly, but any NBC. What am I eyeballing before I make access to my patient?
Fire.
Okay, are there fluids or any kind of chemicals leaking from the car? What else can cause my scene safety to be a little questionable? Okay, so is there smoke coming from the car?
Other traffic.
other traffic. Absolutely, guys. Please, please, please. If you're the first on scene and you get really excited, you're like, oh man, that car is jacked up. This is going to be a really good trauma call. And it's on 75 and you're parked on the shoulder and you just fling open that door to go run to that patient. No, you're playing Frogger. All right. Make sure you are clearing your scene. You have no oncoming traffic before you open that door and try to go walk to your patient if you don't have traffic control in place already. Okay. What were we just talking about? Okay, so if there's smoke coming, yeah. What if the patient hit like a power line? All right, and if I have active wires or active lines on my scene, or if the patient ran into like a fuel truck, okay, and I've got stuff leaking, what am I going to go on that scene? No, not. What am I going to say? Get on the radio with dispatch and say, hey, I need fire on scene. I need hazmat. We need to get in touch with George Power and tell them they need to come cut electricity to this entire block because I've got live wires. I can't access my patient. What if you do have a patient with live wires and they're conscious?
Do not touch the wires.
Stay in your car. Do not get out of your car. That's going to be the safest place for them if they've got live wires. Okay. What else am I looking for? On any NBC. About maybe brake marks. Okay, that can maybe give you an indication if you don't see brake marks. What are some things we maybe can start thinking about? Okay, so maybe they were going really fast.
Maybe they weren't alert.
Maybe they weren't alert when this crash happened. Maybe I've got an underlying medical reason that this crash happened. Maybe they were hypoglycemic. Maybe they're having a stroke. Maybe they've got drugs in their system. Because typically, guys, if you're alert and aware when you're driving, usually there's some kind of brake marks. So you're like, oh crap, let me hit the brakes. Usually if we don't see brake marks, most of the time that indicates that the patient wasn't paying any attention or they were already altered when the crash happened. What else? Okay, so the type of car, right? Is this a big, heavy, F-350 or is this a smart car that hit this semi truck? All right.
Is it like an older car?
Is it an older car? Why does that matter?
Because older cars.
It's a valid
To be safe.
So older cars are built like tanks, right? They don't really have the
Rumble zones.
the effective airbags so much, but they can withstand collision very well. All right. The car can.
Yeah.
You can't.
Modern
You
cars
can't.
don't because they're designed to brake so you don't.
They're designed to accordion. The modern cars are designed to take the brunt of the impact and the damage, so you don't have to. But yeah, some older cars, guys, they don't even have airbags. Keep that in mind. What about where we are?
How hard is it going to be?
Okay, so do I have anything that could cause problems getting to my patient?
Did they go into Chattahoochee River?
Okay, are they in the Chattahoochee River?
So,
Okay, what if I'm on a highway versus a neighborhood street? How fast was my car going? Right? If I'm on 285, probably highway speeds. That usually means at least 65 miles an hour. Hopefully, ideally, if they're in a neighborhood or residential street, they weren't going that fast. Some people do. But we can usually infer lower speeds on city streets or residential streets versus highway speeds on the highway. If you're going faster, is the damage going to be greater?
Yes.
All right. What else do I notice about this particular scene? Okay, so the dash. Right, are you talking about like right here?
yeah.
All right, look at the driver's seat.
Yeah.
What should be here that's not? Space,
Yes.
right? Like this dude's engine was probably touching his knees.
It
Right.
looks like the back of his chair, his spine had a grand old time.
Uh-huh. Okay, this seat is completely flat. This seat should be at a 90-degree angle. All right, so guys, if we see this right here, where the external part of the car is now where the internal area should be. What do we call that? Cab intrusion. I would label this as significant cab intrusion. Why is that important? What kind of injuries can I suspect for this patient?
Broken
Their
legs.
legs are gonna be jello, right? Because they should have had this space and now that external part of the car was shoved up against where their legs and their knees should be. Okay. Also, what do I need to notate about the location of the damage? Okay, so was it head? Was it lateral? Was it rear? But also what? What about what side of the car? Right? So this is definitely, you know, front end damage to both the driver and the passenger side. Guys, are you always just gonna have one patient in a car?
No.
Nope.
No. So you need to notate where the significant damage is in relation to what patient was in each seat. All right, because I'm probably not as worried about if they were rear passengers because this doesn't really look as jacked up, right? This looks pretty intact, but these front passengers I'm really concerned about. So notate the location of the significant damage in relation to where your patient or patients were sitting. All right. What else kind of goes into that? What are we concerned that our patient was or was not wearing? A seatbelt, right? Do we want our patient to be wearing a seatbelt?
Yeah, that's my favorite.
Yes. All right. Seatbelts are like airbags, guys. They're designed for safety, but sometimes they do cause what? Sometimes they do cause injuries. Okay. So that's going to be a seatbelt abrasion or seatbelt mark. Okay.
So if the crash was bad enough to do that to you, not wearing a seatbelt would probably have been worse.
Uh-huh. Yeah, this is going to hurt. Maybe if it's placed correctly, maybe a broken clavicle, broken collarbone. But had that patient been thrown forward even more, ejection, bad injuries. All right. Fun little call I had was an MVC. It was like right at 4 a.m. Two dudes come on scene. They're acting kind of squirrely when they get there. They ran. It was just their car. They ran into like a tree or something. I can't remember. It was a stationary object. There was nobody else involved. And we get there, and one guy in particular is really hurt. He's like, "Man, I got shoulder pain. Like it just really, really hurts." We get him to the back, and he's got a seatbelt mark, which good for you. You're wearing your seatbelt. Cops come on scene. They do their thing. They're like, "Hey, I need to get your license." Who was driving? The guy who wasn't our patient was like, "Yeah, man, I was driving." Got the license, did the whole workup, did the police report. And then turns out the seatbelt mark was kind of evidence, right? Because he was like, "Hey, man, okay, so his buddy was driving and you were just in the front passenger seat." "Yeah, I was in the front passenger seat. I wasn't driving." "But where was the seatbelt mark?" "This way." Because what was my patient that had the seatbelt mark going this way? Drunker than Cooter Brown.
I mean, do you have to tell it?
I didn't, but the dude had his shirt off, and the cop was actually a good cop and picked up on it. I was like,
Like, really? Tell me more about how
"So you're sitting in the
friend
front seat?" Because guys, technically he could have been where? He could have been in the passenger seat and on the driver's side, right? To get the seatbelt mark that way. But he was adamant. "No, man, I was sitting up front with my buddy. We saw it. It's like a deer or a dog, and we swerved." Well, then why is your seatbelt mark that way? Somewhere, right? So yeah, I mean, and that can give you, if it was going this way, they were on the passenger side, right? So it can kind of be a little telling as to if your patient was driver or passenger. What else?
Kind of a random note, I consider if it's a gas or electric car, battery fires are nasty and toxic.
Yeah.
Very good point. If it's a car that can have a chargeable battery, they are wired differently. So if the airbags aren't deployed on like a car that has a battery, there's different wires you have to cut to make sure your scene is safe. Fire's trained on that or not. Yeah, if there's fire to the actual battery, there's a lot of toxic fumes that are released. So very valid point.
If it's a electric car, those batteries are like way worse.
Yes.
If they like actually catch fire, they
Yes.
offload gas of 3,000.
Lovely.
That's really high.
And aren't they usually, like, aren't the batteries in a lot of electric cars under the passenger
Mhm.
compartment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're in a really weird location, typically under the seats. But yeah, also too, guys, is your car on fire? Right? Are you gonna approach that scene?
No.
So yeah. What else do I want to look for? What is that called?
Spider web,
Spider webbing of the windshield.
that means something.
That means something hit the windshield. Because guys, windshields can get cracked during MVCs if they come in contact with something. Sometimes if the airbags sometimes can cause a cracked windshield because they do come out so forcefully. But if we see this distinctive circular aspect that looks like a spider web, what can I infer?
Something hit right there,
Something hit that. If my patient was not restrained,
like in their face.
a body part hit that area, okay? Probably if they were in the front, it's probably their noggin. So if we see spider webbing on the windshield, if it's distinct like that and we're not like, oh, did the rest of the crash cause that damage? I might have some significant head trauma on my patient.
Are you gonna be able to tell if that crack comes from the inside or outside?
Typically, because guys, what are windshields and windows designed to do in newer cars?
They don't.
They're shatterproof in a sense, right? If you ever notice, if your window gets busted in, the next time you go on scene to an MVC, look at the debris of the glass. It's not spiky and it's not in sharp shards usually. It kind of crumbles into not sharp pieces on purpose. So usually you can tell if it's like protruding out or in. You can usually tell if it comes from the inside of the car.
Windshields are laminated, so like they don't typically like fracture to pieces. Like you can chop them with an axe all day long, and it'll still be there. But side windows, you can actually just
Mhm.
cannot bust out of it. It's not gonna happen.
He's tried on his ex's vehicle. Didn't work. But yeah, so guys, that brings up a good point too. Can we do any kind of extrication?
Maybe.
If the patient's just like, just kind of belly just stuff or something.
So my heavy duty, I bought these for my husband when he graduated fire school, but he was like, I'm not a paramedic, I can't really use half the stuff on them. Very expensive trauma shears.
Raptors?
Mhm.
I got on with it.
They have a little window punch on the end of the shear. You have them?
I got holding hair right here, like a transformer, but it's personal.
So
And kind of-
these are what I have. This thing right here, that's a window punch. Okay. Guys, that's gonna be the extent that I would ever recommend if you need like that immediate access to your patient, the car's not on fire. Because sometimes guys, a minor car crash can cause the patient to become entrapped. If it's just a simple, they're pinned up against like a concrete median or their door got hit just perfectly where it's just kind of jammed and they can't open it. There's a window punch on these
Maybe they're
things.
also like unconscious for medical reason, and the doors are locked.
Careful with that. Careful with that.
Another police thing.
Usually, but as long as you can prove in your documentation that you were acting in good faith of your patient, then you're usually covered. All right, so
I
guys, if
didn't
you're
hear
gonna
this
do any kind of
question,
window punch,
Professor A. What did he
lots of
say?
times, have like a tactical knife where it's like a pocket knife and it's got a window punch on the end. If you're ever gonna use these, try to do it in a corner of the windshield. Don't just do it in the flat open space. Like try to go in one of the three corners. Punch this thing in there. It'll cause it to kind of crumble up. You can maybe reach inside, access your patients, bag them, unlock the door. Whatever.
Professor A, can you hear me?
We're cutting quarters in half of these things. It was crazy.
It can. They're very, very, very sharp, very durable. I've cut through like an entire leather belt with it one time. So. They're worth the money if you know this is what you want to do.
Professor A, can you hear me?
But guys, be careful. Obviously, you know, with the unconscious patient, that is technically proper.
Hello?
You can cause injury to yourself, but just the window punch is the only thing that I would recommend. Maybe cutting a seatbelt if you need to. Yeah. Fun fact for you guys in your own car: if you pull a Michael Scott and you drive into a lake, all right, and anybody watch like survival shows? Do you know how to handle that if your car is like sinking underwater? When should you try to open the door? When you're fully underwater, okay? But if you can't wait that long, and if you're panicking, because I probably be panicking, what else can you use?
Professor A, can you hear me?
If you're trying to do like your elbow, probably not gonna work.
Your address.
Your headrest, right? Take the headrest all the way out, and those little spikes that go into the holes to anchor the headrest are designed to also be able to act as a window punch.
Professor A, can you hear
You're
me?
welcome if I just saved your life. You got that.
As soon as you hit the water.
Yeah.
Roll the windows down for your life.
Hello?
Or
So.
you have manual windows like mine.
And you're good. You're golden.
Once you're underwater, you're not getting those open.
Yeah, I may or may not keep my Raptors in my car if I have to like cut a seatbelt or like cut my kids out of their car seat or have a window punch. They stay in my car.
That was like
I have that
6
one.
different scenarios.
I watch a lot of things that go badly wrong, so I think about this. What's another thing? What do I want to notate? It's part of your scene size up, literally part of your scene size up, but number of patients, right? Make sure that all your patients are accounted for. Some patients might have been, it might have been a full carload. Some people might have had their seatbelts on, some others didn't, and they got ejected, and we don't know.
Where are they?
Where are they? Exactly. Guys, it wasn't my call, but it was on my shift. This happened, it was on 285. Came out as a single car MVC, hit the concrete median. Windshield was not intact, the car was jacked up, but there was no patient like inside. They got fire and PD out there. They shut down the highway both ways because they were like, well, hey, maybe the patient got ejected over to the oncoming. Like, I think they were on, I want to say maybe 285. So maybe they got, you know, on the other side of 285. They looked all around. They looked into like the ditches on each side. They're like, dude, they're not here. They must have like gotten up and walked away. Because that happens sometimes, particularly to who? Drunk drivers. Why? You hear, guys, you hear about this all the time. Somebody's driving drunk. They get into a car wreck with somebody else. The other car is usually the people who sustain the most significant injuries, and the person who's driving drunk normally doesn't get as bad of an injury. Why? Okay, your reaction time drastically goes down the more intoxicated you get. If you're to the point where you're falling asleep at the wheel or you're passing out at the wheel because you're drinking, if once you come in contact with that impact, if you're in an unconscious or very drunk state, what's your body going to be like during that impact?
Ragdoll.
Like a rag doll, just kind of floating around, getting tossed around. If you're aware that you're about to get hit by a car, what is your instinct?
Right.
Oh shit, right? Everything tenses up. You typically extend that leg to hit the brake because your muscles are tense, because everything's in that rigid state, it causes more damage. So that's why you see a lot of times patients who have drugs or alcohol on board are not significantly injured because they just kind of get tossed around and they're not tensed up. They don't have those significant injuries.
I'll say, if you've never been in a car accident, it hurts like hell the next couple days after when that muscle pain kicks in, just because you tense up.
Huh?
It-
Yeah,
I'm
we
just so
tell
sorry.
every patient if it's a fender bender, if they don't want to go to the hospital and we're okay with them refusing, hey, ibuprofen and ice is going to be your best friend for the next 48 hours. Because that tension causes usually like a delayed pain. All All right, so what they were just like, hey, we've checked this entire area. Fire's been out here, PD's been out here. We cannot find the patient. We're canceling, ourselves from the scene because there's no patient found. I'm like, all right, dude, that's totally fine. Like, if multiple different people have confirmed that there's no patient there, we figured it was just somebody who was drunk and walked away. But then the sun came up, and somebody called in after they had cleared the scene that there was a body in a tree. That was the patient. I mean, it wasn't that far away, but it was like 4 a.m. when this call went out, so it was dark. And they didn't think to look up for the patient.
So they did?
No, they're just like chilling, like, hey guys, get me down, please. Back. I mean, that would have been like a Breaking Bad scene, but yeah. Hold on.
The driver of that vehicle would notice when there was a loud thud of the patient leaning in it.
I've totaled 2 cars. I've split the truck 3 times, end over end. I've walked away every time.
Excuse me?
So you guys can unmute yourself if you need to ask questions, if you guys are trying to talk.
Well, I did,
I
but
can't hear anybody.
yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay. Yeah, try your best to make sure all your patients are accounted for. Okay. Yeah, guys, look for spider webbing, look for cab intrusion. If they had to be extricated, notate the side of the car that the majority of the damage was based on where your patient was, airbag deployment, scene safety, all of that jazz. Yeah, Melody, if you can hear me, I don't know what to do on my end. I've tried unmuting you. But I can't,
Can you
I
hear
can't
me
hear
now?
anything.
Hello?
Ooh, is it? Hey, Melody, ask your question now.
Yeah, this was like way back on the trauma share part. Like,
Okay, I'm sorry.
because I didn't hear anything anyone said regarding the trauma shears when you had brought up the glass breaking situation.
So there's a really expensive pair of trauma shears you can buy. They're called Raptors. And on the end of one of the handles for your fingers, it's a little window punch. So if you needed to use it to very minimally gain access to your patient, that you could do that.
Okay, and then that's because I kind of came back in when you were saying about where specifically it hit. So we would need to be like on the opposite side of our patient and like hit the corner. Is that what you were saying?
So yeah, I mean, in theory, you would always be on the opposite side of the window of your patient, but in one of the 3 corners, that's where it's going to be the least, it's going to be the weakest. So hitting one of the 3 corners if you're trying to punch out one of the windows with the.
Okay, so never hit center is what you said. Okay, gotcha. Okay, cool.
I mean, you can, but it's more likely that you'll sustain an injury.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Hear about recently, this year, there was like a woman, she gave birth in the car.
Yeah, and they couldn't find the baby.
And then she was like, "Where's my baby?" He's like, "Right here." She's like, "No." And they're like, "There's no baby." in this
That was local. I want to say that was like Gwinnett or Clayton. It was very close to Atlanta. This woman was sick. I think she was driving to the hospital because she was in labor. And she got into a wreck, and during the process of the wreck, the baby was born and came out, and they couldn't find the baby like in the car, like the newborn baby in the car. The baby survived. Like surprisingly.
Was it?
I think it was on
Oh, it was like under the seat, or it had been. Yeah, it was. Yeah, but the baby survived. It's nuts. So, yeah, 'cause she had her younger kid with her, and she's like, "No, the one that was just in here. Like, find this one."
Yeah, everybody on the scene's like,
All right, so guys, there's a lot of different things that we're notating. noticing on scene for us to say, ooh, high or low index of suspicion based on where the damage is. I might need to do a focused assessment or start here for the injuries, all of that stuff. All right. So there's a lot that goes into your scene sizes when it comes to NVCs. Right. Okay-ish? Okay. Talked about that. All right. So what do we got kids in the car? Car seats. And guys,
They just changed that,
what do you mean?
like, very recently.
What did they change?
Extended, like, the age.
Oh, yeah. Kids these days, they're recommending that they're in a booster seat until they're like 10
Oh, really?
or 12.
They, I think they just don't think about it.
Really?
That's in the back of the car? They
Yes.
stay in the back seat?
Yes, ideally. Yes. All right, so guys, if we have kids in the car, what is something we want to ask or notice? Especially if they're younger kids. Were they in a car seat? Were they properly restrained? Right? One of y'all in here is a parent, right? Anybody but Sean? If you're a parent, it is very easy to ask this in a judgmental manner. If you have a patient who has a 2-year-old, 18-month-old in the front seat, sitting in their lap on 75 and no car seat, it's very easy to jump quickly to judgment and / anger, right? But guys, we are not asking this question in a judgmental manner. Why do we want to ask, hey, where's the car seat, or was the kid in a car seat?
Seatbelts are not gonna work on small stuff.
Guys, my suspicion of index goes through the roof. If I have a smaller child in a car accident, I don't care if it even was a smaller fender bender that was not in a car seat. Why? Guys, cars are not designed for little people. They're designed for who? Adults. Average size adults. So even if that child was sitting in the back seat, if it's a 3-year-old, they were sitting in the back seat, even if they had a seatbelt on, how could that be harmful to my patient if they're not in a car seat?
Or they could just slip out of it.
Okay? If a 3-year-old sits in a regular car seat, where is that seatbelt going to hit them? Especially the shoulder.
Right up against their neck, man.
All right? Like right here. Okay? We can cause significant damage to their airway. We can cause, depending on how forceful the impact was, any type of spinal injury. Or they could just do what? Slip out the bottom. Okay? Cars are not designed for the small height and the small mass of little kids. They need to be in a car seat. All right? What am I concerned with if my pediatric patients was in the front seat? Even if they were in a car seat.
Airbag.
Why?
And car seats face backwards.
So they're supposed to. That's the most ideal position for a car seat, is rear facing in the middle of the car. But you have to turn around eventually because they get really tall and they like sit like this.
Real quick, personal anecdote. My car seat saved my life when I was in an accident when I was 8 years old. I was in the back seat, and we rear-ended a tree, like the car spun, and the seat got sucked back into the trunk. If I was not in that booster seat, my spine would have been there with it. I would have been a paraplegic at best and dead at worst. It absolutely. I cannot put my kid in the car without a seat back.
Mm-hmm. If they're in the front seat, guys, okay, so imagine cars are designed for who? Adults, average size adults, right? If you sit in a car seat, or it's not in a car seat, in a seat of a car, where do the seatbelts hit you? Where they're supposed to, right? If you're in the front seat, where do the airbags hit you? Typically, ideally, this area right here to prevent your chest and your face from hitting the dashboard, okay? We already talked about the seatbelt height is not conducive for smaller, younger kids. But also, if these kids are in the front seat, even if they're restrained and the seatbelt works, where on a shorter person sitting in the front seat is that airbag going to hit?
Their face.
Guys, they're extremely forceful. We can have significant spinal injury. That's why if you ever notice your sun visors that flip down on the front seats of your car, they have all of that yellow and black warning caution instructions talking about children should always be in the back seats, all that stuff. That's why it kills kids.
Oh, and like new cars, the airbags turn off.
If there's not weight, if it doesn't sense weight there. Yep. So, yes, we want to make sure, hopefully, ideally, these kids are in a car seat. What do we also need to worry about too? That the car seat is what?
In the right direction.
Right? So ideally in the right direction. We're going to watch that video that talks about that. But yeah, we want to make sure they're buckled in the car seat and that the car seat was actually secured by the seat belt or like any anchoring devices in the car. All right. Guys, I ran that call. It was on 75 right there by Georgia Tech. They had an 18-month-old person, baby, in the front seat in their lap.
Oh, man.
What a Britney Spears.
So the adults had no injuries. The kid had to be taken to Eccleston. Like the kid was pretty critical. So yes.
Eaglestone's open for the Eaglestone's open in Chattanooga.
No, Eccleston. That is the pediatric trauma center here in Atlanta. Also, if you're not a parent, you won't know this, but the straps in the seatbelt or in the car seat themselves need to be properly placed, right? How do car seats, most of all car seats look? They've got shoulder straps. It comes together right here with a clip, and then they have the two that comes in between their legs with a clip, all right? Where does that clip need to go here?
Up against their chest, like where their sternum is.
Right here on the sternum. What if they place it too high? What if it's not on the sternum and it's way too high here?
Airway.
Airway. What if it's way too low down here?
Abdominal.
It can cause internal injuries. All right, it's designed to go right there on top of the sternum because the sternum can absorb most of that shock or that impact. If it's too high or too low, it can actually cause injuries. So, yeah. Just notate these things. This is just an illustration of why it's important that we ask and ensure that these kids are in car seats.
Every year, many car accidents take place at speeds of 50 kilometers an hour. Children are especially at risk, and a correct positioning of the child's safety seats is therefore very important. We will now take a look at what happens if your child is sitting forward-facing in a frontal collision. If the child is sitting forward-facing in a frontal collision, this exerts huge forces on the shoulder and neck regions, as well as on the child's head. This can lead to death or permanent injuries as paralysis. If your child is sitting rear-facing during the collision, the force will be spread over a greater area of the body, and there'll be less pressure on the neck, head, and inner organs. If your child sits rear-facing instead of forward-facing, this reduces the risk of serious injuries and death by more than 90%. Children should therefore be seated rear-facing as long as possible, or until they are 4 years old.
So guys, again, if you're not a parent, you're not really aware of these things, but they say to keep the kids rear-facing as long as you possibly can. Sometimes they give it like up until they're 40 pounds. But that's why we want to make sure the kids are in a car seat. If they're not, index of suspicion is extremely high for these kiddos. Again, seatbelt abrasions, they can be superficial. They can cause underlying injuries such as broken clavicles. That's a really common one. Sometimes if it's significant enough, they can cause some internal injuries, but usually we're going to see more good than harm when it comes with the use of seatbelts. If they're used properly, right? Guys, how should you wear your seatbelt? Lap belt goes over your pelvis right here, and then your shoulder belt goes here, okay? Don't be that person who just wears a lap belt and just puts the shoulder belt behind their back.
I guess somebody could.
People actually do that, that seems like it'd be more work.
Yeah, there are adults that still do that, unfortunately.
Like they sit on
He
top of.
flips it behind him and he'll put the shoulder strap on.
No,
Why?
that's not how it works. Guys, they actually make, because most cars, if you're not buckled and you're in drive, it does what? It yells at you. They literally make, one of my students showed me one. It's just a seatbelt, you just put it in the part, so the car thinks that you're buckled in and it shuts up.
You're going out of your way to pay money to be less, to yourself.
Oh,
Yeah.
my ex literally took out the sensor.
No, just wear your effing seatbelt. But yeah, guys, if it's too high or too low, it can cause some problems. Where else can we see the seatbelt cause major issues if it's not used appropriately? Okay. So yeah, if it's too high, too low, but particularly in who? Pregnant patients, right? That baby belly, guys, gets in the way of everything, all right? But you've got to make sure if you've got a significantly pregnant patient who was hopefully wearing their seatbelt, that lap belt was placed properly. Where is it supposed to go? Under the belly, still sitting on top of the pelvis. Some women have it on top of their stomach. Okay, if that's a significant crash, a significant impact, we can probably imagine the damage that can cause. Okay, so if you know anyone who's pregnant, let that be your PSA. Lap belt goes under the baby belly on the pelvis as best as possible. Okay, did we not talk about the 3 collisions that happened during a car crash yet? All right, so we need to think there are 3 collisions for every car crash. There are 3 separate collisions that happen that can raise my index of suspicion, that can make it a significant versus non-significant MOI. All right, what are those 3 collisions? What's the first one? A car hitting an object. Right, that's another thing that goes into my scene size up. What did my car hit? Did it hit a stationary object that caused a very abrupt stop? Did it hit another car? Did it hit an animal? You know, that goes into your scene size up as well. But that first impact is the car hitting an object. All right, what's the second collision? Your body, the patient hitting something stationary inside the car. Whether that's the seatbelt that locks up and stops them, whether that's them being thrusted into the airbag or the steering wheel or the windshield. That's the second collision, is the patient's body coming in contact with a stationary object. All right, what's that third collision?
Patient's organs hitting the chest cavity.
All right, so all of that movement, again, that energy that's only being transferred, not destroyed, that impact of the patient's body hitting a stationary object, your organs are being kind of jostled around. Your organs are hitting stationary objects in your body. Okay, so that's how we start to see that index of suspicion. That's how that coupe contra coupe injury happens. First collision is the car to an object. The second is the patient's body to an object, and the third is the internal of the patient's body to the body. Right, your brain hitting your skull, or your, spleen going into your rib cage type thing. So we need to remember the 3 different types of crashes for every single MVC. What's another thing we need to look for scene size up when we see an MVC? Steering wheel deformity. Right, if that steering wheel looks all crumpled up, what caused that steering wheel to be crumpled up?
Yeah,
The patient's chest, most likely. If it's a defective airbag that didn't deploy, or it doesn't have airbags, period. Patient's chest, a patient's face. Steering wheel deformity is never a good sign. That drastically increases my index of suspicion for some internal chest injuries. Car versus pedestrians. What are some things I need to think about here?
Did they go over the car,
How did the patient fall? Were they dragged? Did the car run over them like a speed bump? Did the patient were they thrown forward? Were they thrown over the car? Did they hit the windshield? Right? Let's try to see where our patient is in relation to the car. That's going to tell me, you know, possibly more injuries depending on how my patient was thrown. What else? How fast was the car going? Right? Is this somebody who's just high off of acid and they're just strolling around 75 and they got hit at highway speeds? Or was this somebody walking at a crosswalk at Georgia State somewhere when they weren't supposed to be and the car was only going maybe like, 10 miles an hour? What else?
Like where it-
Okay, so how might we determine where that person could have gotten hit? So yeah, what direction, but also what goes into that? Yeah, we're gonna figure that out.
What about like the volume of the car itself?
Okay, so is the car jacked up?
Yeah.
That's not good. That's significant impact. Right? But also what plays into maybe where my patient's injuries might be.
What they landed on?
How they
How tall is your patient? If you're a normal sized adult, typically if you're kind of standing at a normal position in front of a car, where's probably the majority of your injuries gonna be? Unless you get thrown and like you hit your head, yes.
That part is.
But typically here-ish. If you're a much younger kid or significantly shorter, same car, same height, where's your injuries gonna be? Head, neck, and chest. All right, so the height of the patient. And also, what kind of car was it? Was it a jacked up Hummer or was it a smart car? All right, how heavy, how high was the car? Gonna go into my index of suspicion. All right. Car versus bicycle. Again, this changes the height of your patient, right? Is it going to increase or decrease the height? Typically decrease a little bit, right? Because we're going to see the position. Again, is this an adult-sized bike? Is this an adult patient? Is this a pediatric patient? A smaller bike? More importantly, are they wearing a helmet? Okay. Is it cracked? Is the helmet compromised? Guys, if you have a helmet on scene, whether it's a bike, typically we run into this more so if it's like a full encompassing, like a bike motorcycle helmet. When do we need to take the helmet off? Okay. Okay. Can I just leave it on? Yeah.
What if?
When it's off, like
I mean, you're not back at a pinch if they have a motorcycle helmet on.
Does anybody here ride a bike? Like motorcycle? Okay. Do y'all know like anything about it? Right. So when do I need to remove that? Because sometimes when we remove it, it can cause more harm, right? Because it's on there really snug, right? It's not just like, okay, just let me gently take this off.
That's what it calls it.
Put seat on first and then take it off.
So there's a particular way, I think there's a video we're gonna watch and talk more about it. And I think head and spine or face and neck. But yeah, guys, if your patient needs management of their ABCs, especially their airway, and you can't get to it because of the helmet's gotta go. But usually if we can maintain the airway and we suspect like some type of spinal trauma, we try to leave the helmet on unless we have several people on scene that can help take it off. We'll get to that later, but we always want to bring what with us? The helmet. Like from the scene, if they were riding a bicycle or a motorcycle, we always want to bring the helmet with us because that's going to go part into of our index of suspicion, all that jazz. Motorcycle crashes. Good or bad?
Bad.
Usually always not good, right? If there's any significant force behind them. Guys, why are these more detrimental to the patient than a car versus car?
They're faster, and motorcycles don't do really secure.
Okay, so motorcycles are typically faster, but they don't have any what?
No outside.
Any container. right? If you are hit from behind or something happens on a motorcycle, where do you go?
Off the
Anywhere,
motorcycle.
all right? You come off of the motorcycle. So we typically will see patients thrown from the motorcycles. What do we want to, even if it's just an ejection from a car, what do we want to notate? How far away is the patient from the car, from the motorcycle? How far were they thrown? Are they just like, 10 feet or are they 10 yards? Right, that makes a big difference. The more momentum they catch in the air, the harder they're gonna fall, the bigger the injury. Okay. If you do ride bikes, you should be taught how to like lay your bike down, right? What does that mean?
Just like skid and like put the bike in front of you.
So purposefully, if you know that you're about to be in a collision, like there's no way you can avoid it, instead of trying to like swerve or hit things head on, they typically will teach you to like skid the bike where the bike is going in front of you, like you're purposely intentionally laying the bike down. So the bike takes the brunt of the impact and you don't. If the patient does that, if it's a significant impact, where do we usually see the injury? Pelvic area, right? 'Cause how are they positioned when they're riding a bicycle or a motorcycle? They're straddling the motorcycle, okay? So typically we will see a lot of broken pelvises, dislocated hips, because the legs kind of do like a wishbone effect, just kind of go out. When I worked in the ICU, there was a dude who was in a bad motorcycle wreck. He laid his bike down and he had, I think both of his hips were fractured in several different places, or both sides of his hip. And I had so much sympathy for this guy because he was on pain meds. But guys, if you have a pelvic fracture, where did all of that blood go? If you're a guy, gravity takes over and it goes where? To the boys. Guys, this dude's each testicle was like this big and just black and blue in color. And I'm like, I cannot empathize, but I sympathize. So we see a lot of pelvic fractures when it comes to, especially when the patients lay the bike down. Okay. What else do we need to notate? Or what else do they need to be mindful of if you're riding a bike? Protective clothing.
Were they wearing any?
Were they wearing any? I think one of the Instagrams just posted a clip. Somebody's foot was literally like split down the middle because guess what they were wearing when they were riding their motorcycle? Is what should he really be wearing? All right, so boots, right? What else? Helmet, yes please. Leather clothing. That's the most ideal. Why? It's not just because it looks cool. Okay, so yeah, guys, it's going to take the brunt of the impact from the car or from the asphalt versus your skin. Okay, so leather protective clothing is ideal to prevent like shearing, like just that major road rash of the skin. So notate if your patient was wearing those or if they were wearing a wide beater, jean shorts, and flip-flops with no helmet.
Or were naked. I actually saw a video one time of somebody that was riding a motorcycle naked.
Okay. Was it in Florida?
I think it was in South America.
Or if they were naked?
Like if you watch like motorcycle racing and a guy just comes off and it's
Yeah.
like 100 yards and just stands up.
Yeah, if they have their protective gear on, then it's no biggie, right? But if they don't, guys, that entire time they're sliding on the asphalt, that's their skin being sheared off. Ooh, awful. Awful. So this is what I'm talking about for like a full facial helmet. Okay, so it fully encompasses here, goes around the chin. You've got the little windshield right there, if you will, and it attaches right here under the chin. This is what we have issues with if we have to access the patient's airway that we need to remove. What if this patient wasn't wearing a helmet? Their helmet.
His head's caved in.
That's brain matter. Okay, so please wear your helmets. We do. Okay. But yeah, guys, make sure that you this goes to the hospital. If the patient gets up and is walking around the side of the highway and holding the helmet like this, be like, dude, you really need to go get a workup and we need to take this because the doctor's going to want to see this, right? Because what if the dude just kind of bebopping into the ER and we're like, hey, probably want to do a head CT, and they're like, they're fine, they're A-no-transport, I don't see any issues. Here's why. Oh, yeah, okay. Guys, what do we need to do to properly convey the extent of the damage? We can say there was cab intrusion, it was rolled over 3 times, blah, blah, blah. What can we do? Take a picture of the car, just the car, and you can show it to the doc, especially if the patient doesn't seem like they have any injuries. When you get to the ER, be like, hey, this was their car. You probably want to do a full workup, right? Don't get anything like don't get the license plate if you can, because again, that can be a violation of HIPAA. Also take into the fact that if there's any type of criminal or civil case that comes from this MVC, that's technically evidence, and they can seize your phone. And again, everything on your phone is gained access to by the cops. So just remember that. So just have a whole separate phone. Don't have a burner phone.
You say Grady issue work phones for paramedics?
No. All right, so falls. What do I want to think about here? There's not as much that goes into the scene size up as the MVC, but there's different questions I'm asking. How high did they fall from? Was it a ground level fall? Was it from a 15-foot treehouse? Was it from a 60-foot ledge? Right?
Skydiving accident.
Was it? Oh, yeah. Literally, when I went skydiving, like a couple months after we went there at the same place, there was somebody who their chute didn't open correctly, and they fell and they died. And I'm like, well, do I want to do it again? So yeah, was it a skydiving accident? I don't think that we would be on scene except to say this is a 48 if that happened. But what else?
Did they fall head first or feet first?
What part of their body fell first? Okay. Did they fall onto their head? Did they fall onto their feet? Did they fall onto their side? What else? What did they fall on top of? Did they fall on top of a hard concrete tile floor? Did they fall onto a bed of pillows? Did they fall onto grass? All right, so just, did the surface that they fell on help any with absorbing any of that impact? Usually the answer is no. But a lot of times we get like falls from playgrounds. What are playgrounds made up of? The new high-tech new ones these days. The floor, if you will, the ground of these playgrounds are like a very compacted like rubber to try to absorb some of the shock when these kids fall from monkey bars. So keep in mind too, again, little Susie here, she fell out of the tree, she landed on her feet, she's just fine. All of the injury should be to her feet, right? Energy can only be what? Transferred, not created or destroyed. So all of that momentum of her falling to the ground, that impact, depending on if her legs were locked or how her body was positioned when she fell, it's going to continue to travel upward. Okay, so it's very possible that if you fall on your feet, depending on the angle and all of that stuff, that you could have some spinal compromise.
That's why you should fall with your knees bent.
Fall with your knees bent?
Yeah.
Or just like tuck and roll, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so again, index of suspicion, don't say, oh, it's just going to be an ankle injury. No, we need to do a head to toe assessment to make sure there's no other body areas affected.
It's called like with the spine. It's like
Compression, spinal compression.
coaxial loading.
Something like that. Penetrating trauma. All right, guys. So we've already determined, or we've already defined penetrating trauma as. Okay, guys, there is a hole in your patient that should not be there. There is a hole that is not anatomically supposed to be there. Okay, What if we have, because you can have somebody get stabbed and they just kind of stab and then they do what with a knife? Okay, what if we have this? What if we have an impaled object? That's what we call this. The thing is still sticking in the patient. What do we do with that? She's like, oh, dude, that sucks. Let me help you out. Never, ever. Well, there are 2 exceptions, and we'll talk about that. But 99.99% of the time, you never, ever, ever remove an impaled object. This dude, if I come on scene and I see this, A, sorry you're having a bad day. But B, how do I deal with this? I'm going to leave it in place, right? What do I do? So I'm going to get bulky dressings, and I'm going to build kind of, do you guys ever play with like the Lincoln logs? Like the wooden sticks that have like the divots in it, you can build like all the stuff around it, or like with it.
I know, I'm actually.
So with this, guys, get some gauze, right? Some Kerlix, some 4x4s, and just build a little wall around whatever object it is, and use some tape and secure that bulky dressing, like the gauze that you just surround the object with. That's how we're going to handle that patient. That's how we're going to treat this impaled object. What does that do? What are we trying to do? We're trying to stabilize it as much as possible, right? Because am I just going to leave this just kind of like flopping without it just being secure in any capacity? No, because what's happening down here?
Cutting things.
Okay, there's still a blade there. There could be great vessels that it's coming up against. There could be organs. There could be all sorts of stuff that if the top part of it is doing this, what's the bottom part doing? Same thing. So we want to stabilize that object as best as possible. We are not going to remove it, and we're going to secure it with bulky dressings and secure the bulky dressings to the patient as best as possible. Guys, don't ever secure the tape that you're trying to anchor down that bulky dressings to the object itself. Don't ever get that 2-inch Grady tape and start, taping here and just go up and over the blade, the handle of the knife, and just be like, oh, I'll just tape it down on the other side.
Is that what actually happened?
Just don't do it. Okay, tape the bulky dressing itself, not the object. Everyone clear on that? Okay. What are your 2 exceptions to the rule when it comes to removing an impaled object? So if it's completely obstructing or directly affecting your airway, or
eyes sometimes.
No, we leave it in the eyes. If it's affecting your ability to manage the airway or do compressions, you can remove the object.
At the point where you need compressions.
Correct.
You might need those.
No. You're alive now, but you might not be later. Here, let me expedite that process so I can do compressions later. All right, so if it's affecting your ability to control the airway or do compressions, you can remove the object. All right, what's the other not as crazy critical exception to that rule? Because why don't we remove something that's impaled? I don't know what it's touching, right? I don't know where the blade of that knife is resting up against. I don't know what it's butt up against, all right? It is very possible that in the process of removing that blade, I could cut something that wasn't initially cut. Or it's very possible that the blade of that knife is acting as a tourniquet, or, the whole like little boy who put the finger in the dam so the dam didn't like burst. There could be a hole somewhere and the blade of that knife is preventing, it's butt up against that hole and it's preventing that whatever from bleeding out. So we don't remove the object because we can't see inside. We can't see what that blade's touching. Okay, so knowing why we don't remove it, what's my second exception? The cheek. If I have, let's say like a pencil or something that is totally penetrating my cheek, it's a through and through. I can see the eraser on this side and I can see the pencil point on this side. I can remove that. Why?
There's no great vessels and you can see.
I can see the inside of the injury and the outside of the injury. There's not a ton of major vessels that can really cause my patient like to go into hypovolemic shock if I remove that pencil, but I can see the inside and the outside of that anatomy. Okay,
But why would you do that?
what if you got like a long pencil?
Well, I'm just thinking
affecting
the
your
process
airway.
of removing
Yeah,
it's a
what if
lot
you
of
get
pain,
down
maybe better to do that in GG where they can go and pain medicine.
Can you give pain med?
No, that's what I'm saying. So that's what I'm saying, you can pack it and get them to where they can do it.
I mean, you could, but if it's affecting your airway or for any
I'm gonna
reason,
track with that.
that is the only place that you can remove it. Okay? How would you control that bleeding? What would you do? With your gloves?
Well, you could, I mean, you could start that way, but you would
Okay.
just pause, right?
But yeah, guys, you control the bleeding from the outside and the inside. So you would have gauze, like, you know, dual controlling the bleeding from on the inside and outside. If patient's coherent enough, hey, pinch this inside and outside. Okay? What do I want to know, if possible, if I've got,
How long is the blade?
okay, yeah, any type of stab wounds. Hey, do we know, is the weapon still on scene? Can I see the weapon? If I can see or know about the blade or the knife. How long is the blade? Was it, you know, a little 3-inch pocket knife, or was it like an 8-inch chef knife? Okay, what's gonna cause more damage? The longer length of the blade. What else do I wanna know?
It's serrated.
Was it serrated or not? Because what does that mean? What's serrated?
Teeth on the
It's
blade.
got the little grooves, it's got the little teeth at the bottom. Okay, or was it a straight edge? All right, so typically the serrated can cause more damage because it's got more points of impact that it can shear stuff with. Okay, so if we can ask about that, if it's impaled, we can still ask, hey, do you happen to see the length of the blade before it was, you know, shoved into your chest? Because again, I'm worried about how deep it goes, what organs can it reach, what damage can it do. Right?
Do you typically worry, like in front country medicine, like, oh, it's February and you have a metal pipe? I'm worried about like the pipe.
I mean, yeah, but what's going to kill your patient quicker, bleeding out from moving it,
I can
or
take those out.
yeah, it's not a
Like,
huge
big
concern.
one.
Not a huge concern.
In the setting of, like, front country.
Yeah.
You go to the hospital.
Anybody have a song pop up in their head for this picture? I'm disappointed. Bon Jovi.
Oh, shut
Shut
the
up.
Oh my gosh.
You're breaking my spirit. All right. So guys, what if we have something that is like drastically the length of the object is protruding out of the patient?
Put it down some.
Can we do that? Fire, you can play with your toys, right? Because guys, we want to be able to cause less damage as possible, but we still gotta get these patients in the ambulance, right? Like if I've got like a huge fence post sticking through my patient, can I get them on the stretcher and like close the back of the doors, depending on how long it is?
No.
Stuck on the fence.
Okay, it's not a Grey's Anatomy episode. Y'all know the one I'm talking about, where it's like the girl and the older guy.
Oh, yeah.
They were both impaled by the same like pipe or something.
Yes, that was a
Like you have to
train
pick
wreck.
which one's gonna live.
There was also a Night Watch episode of that, where somebody got held on a fence.
But it was just one person.
Yeah.
Yeah, there wasn't like a whole drama of,
Yeah, it was realistic.
They like get really close.
I know, and then one dies.
There's the,
Oh, damn.
there's that picture that showed us. Definite signs of death.
Oh yeah, the decapitation on the fence post.
Yeah.
I was talking about a lot more.
So yeah, guys, get fire. They have the equipment because ideally we want to not be cutting on this object that's sticking out of my patient. Why? Because the motion is going to cause the interior aspect to move around. But if we need to, we can get fire to kind of like, if it's like a tree limb or something, like get their tools and their equipment to kind of cut down the length of whatever it is so we can feasibly transport them. How am I going to transport these patients? What if I've got somebody with a knife sticking out of their back?
Transport them from.
Guys, That would be like maybe the one exception. If you have a patient who has just extensive injuries to the posterior aspect of their body only, or if they have something protruding out of their posterior side of their body, you would transport them prone. Usually we never, ever, ever transport patients like lying face down. Maybe put them on their side, but you're not going to lie them on their back if they have a knife handle sticking out of their back. It's,
Would we put them on
That
their
okay?
side though in that
You can.
case ever? Because like what if,
Hmm.
I mean, I guess they're secured. So that's the-
yeah, so however you place them, we're going to try to make sure that they don't move from that position.
Okay.
Try to tell the patient, hey, don't move around, because it's inevitable, like, you're gonna have a rough bumpy ride back to the hospital anyway, but tell your partner, drive, like, avoid potholes at all costs type thing, but I mean, they're gonna have some type of motion, but just try to make it as less as possible. All right, so we're gonna talk a little bit about some ballistics here, okay? With GSWs, what are some things, if we have the information, we would like to know? Okay, so maybe what the caliber of the bullet was. All right, guys, if y'all are not familiar with firearms or anything like that, there's different sizes and there's different types of bullets. Some are less damaging and some are significantly more damaging. All right, so how big, how wide was the bullet?
Is it a rifle cartridge or a pistol cartridge? Do matter.
Okay, so maybe what type of bullet, not just the size, but what type? All right, because there are bullets that are specifically designed, they're called hollow point bullets or home defense bullets. If those come in contact, the second they come in contact with an object, they kind of expand. Okay, so they cause a lot more damage than just a regular, just regular ammunition that can just kind of go straight through. But the hollow points are designed to, once they impact, they spread out, so they cause more cavitation, causes more damage. All right.
Is it through and through? What's the exit wound?
Let's talk about that. Are you guys forensically trained in firearms or ballistics? Does anybody have a degree? Does anybody have any specialized training in that area? No. Even if you did, let's say you're either a cop or you're specifically trained. I don't even know like what that job title would be. What? Okay, so you're an anthropologist. But you're also an EMT. When you're on the truck, when you're on the job as an EMT, are you working as an anthropologist or a cop? No. So when it comes to entry and exit wounds, you cannot put that in your documentation. Count the number of holes and tell me describe each hole.
Little hole, big hole.
Little hole, big hole, guys. Typically, generally speaking, an entry wound, which means if I got really pissed off at Andy and I shot him, where the bullet goes into the body, typically the diameter of that hole is smaller. It's usually cleaner too. All right, so typically entry wounds are going to be smaller in diameter, and the skin surrounding that entry wound is going to be, it just looks like somebody just took like a punch out, and it's, just a hole. Usually an exit wound, if I shot him through and through in the shoulder, entry wound here, exit wound here. The exit wound, the diameter is usually larger, and the skin is a lot more like jagged and like just gnarly looking, okay?
If they have both, would we document that as one wound or two? Like one gunshot wound or two?
So typically speaking, those are the presentations of your entry versus exit. You're not trained to determine that, right? So when you're documenting these injuries, let's say you've got a patient who had a GSW, you're only going to tell me what's in your documentation. Noted penetrating wounds in patient's right shoulder superior or inferior to the clavicle. What do I want to know about that wound? Give me an approximate diameter. Guys, am I gonna like have a measuring tape and be like, let me measure this from here to here, this is exactly. No. We typically, guys, use the metric system again. So usually millimeters, give an approximate millimeter measurement. Tell me objective findings about that wound. Do you notice any gunshot residue around that wound? Is the skin more so, intact versus, noted a wound approximately, 5 millimeters in diameter, superior to the clavicle on the right side, significant soft tissue damage noted. So you're gonna just tell me where you find the hole that's not supposed to be there, the diameter, and the condition of the skin around it. We cannot say noted entry wound here and noted exit wound here. Okay, so that terminology is not used. Tell me where you found it, approximate diameter, and the condition of the skin around it. Because sometimes it's not a through and through. Sometimes they bounce around and they don't come out. They just stay in there. There's only one hole. Number of holes, where they are, and description of the holes. Okay. Guys, we got to think about this too, depending on the caliber. Oh, what are some other things I might want to know if I have the luxury of this information? Okay, so what was the distance between the gun and the patient? Right? Was I this far away, or was I point blank range? Did I just walk straight up and be like, your homework sucked, bam, right? Right, because that can make a difference, right? The further that bullet has to travel before it comes in contact with the patient, the less momentum it has. But if it's point blank range, it's prime time to do some damage. Okay. Anything else you want to know?
Does the type of gun matter?
Yeah, definitely. We can get that information. Maybe something we want to know just to make sure that we're accounting for all of the possible wounds.
How many shots was it?
How many shells? Okay, so if we see the shells on the scene, how many shots did you hear? How many times did you hear the gun fire? Okay, because guys, sometimes we can get that tunnel vision if we got a significant GSW here, but I mean, and you're pulling in on treating that wound. This has happened to somebody I know. They had a bad GSW to the abdomen, and that was the patient's only complaint. They got him to the trauma center. They made him naked with a blankie, and they found 2 more down here in the leg. So just make sure you're doing head to toe to make sure we're not missing any holes. Fair enough? Okay. Cavitation. Guys, this is something that happens, again, depending on the type of the gun, depending on the type of the ammunition. But it's not usually just the straight trajectory path that has damage caused. If I shot Andy through and through with the shoulder, that pathway, the trajectory of the way that bullet was traveling, you can have injuries outside of that direct path of the bullet because of what we call cavitation, right? The size of the bullet, the power of the gun, those things matter if it was point blank, if it wasn't. So notice here, this is the bullet coming in. Notice that the size of this entry puncture wound, all right? As it travels, all of the movement and the vibration from the movement of that bullet causes literally a ripple effect. So we start to see, even though, yes, this is the path of the bullet, up to X amount of, surrounding area can sustain damage from the trajectory of the bullet. So notice here too, this diameter is typically wider, and it causes more soft tissue damage. So keep that in mind. This is just a demonstration, or an illustration of how cavitation occurs.
It's only a family vacation if all the family is together.
Everybody, welcome back to the channel.
So what you're looking at are a few screenshots that I took from the super slow motion footage of M855A1 going into a clear ballistics gel block. This is another super slow motion video made possible with the help of AIM Research and also into clear ballistics for doing it more. So check out the high speed footage.
All right, so guys, the bullet's right here. This small bullet is clearly not that big, right? So this is a very good imagery of there's the shell, there's the bullet, that cavitation, that bigger surface area that's
Watch what happens
affected.
when it closes. Pow.
Yeah. So it's not just that path that the bullet's taking that I'm concerned with about the damage. It's this, any organs or vessels or structures that is in this proximity to the bullet can have significant injury. Any explosion. Okay, does that make sense? Is that a better picture as to what's going on internally that we can't see? We're talking about these in particular. All right, guys, blast injuries. There's 4 main categories of blast injuries. What am I talking about? Where are we going to see blast injuries? An explosion of some sort. Whether it was an intentional explosion, an accidental, it was chemically induced, whatever it might be. If we have an explosion, there's 4 different categories that can give me different types of injuries. All right, so primary blast injury. What is this?
The actual pressure wave.
This is from the pressure that is released. That barotrauma is what we call it. Injuries that are secondary to high intensity pressure changes. So the shock wave from the explosion, you guys see it all the time in the movies, like if something explodes, if they're like walking towards, what happens to their body? You know, gets blasted away. So that initial pressure released from the explosion itself is going to cause a primary blast injury. What do you think the most common types of primary blast injuries are?
Damage to like the hollow organs.
Barotrauma, guys, pressure. Typically the most common thing we're going to see are ruptured tympanic membranes, ruptured eardrums. Okay, because it's like a little film there with all of that pressure that film can break. So very commonly we see ruptured eardrums. What else? These are more significant. Pneumothoraxes. All right, guys can pop a lung, your lung's hollow. Those are typically the 2 most common that we see as primary blast injury from that barotrauma itself. All right, so secondary blast injuries. How does this happen?
Shrapnel.
So either shrapnel from the maybe a bomb with shrapnel, or what else happens? That blast wave does what to surrounding objects? It picks things up, right? So maybe like a rock or something that was picked up and debris that's blown from that pressure. Any debris that is picked up, whether it's shrapnel or whether it's just surrounding objects of the area, if that's picked up and flown into your patient. Like if a rock is thrown from the pressure and it hits your patient in the head, that's a secondary blast injury. That makes sense? Flying debris. Okay. Tertiary. What does this mean? Okay. Eventually, if you get flung or thrown because of that barotrauma, you're going to do what? You're going to land somewhere, right? So if you are flung, if you're thrown from the blast itself and you fall into a building or you fall onto the sidewalk or you get thrown into a car, anything like that. When your body hits a stationary object from being thrown from that explosion, that's a tertiary blast injury. What is a quaternary blast injury? You can get really creative with these.
Anything after, like radiation.
Okay, so maybe if there's a fire that was caused by the explosion itself, and you have an inhalation injury, or you sustain a burn from the fire that was caused by the explosion, that's a quaternary injury.
Building falls on you.
If the building falls on top of you because it was structurally unsound because of the explosion in the first place, okay, that's quaternary. What else? Guys, anything that injures you that was not in existence before that explosion happens, it's like a big grab bag. If you're running away from an explosion and you trip and you break your ankle, that's a quaternary injury. You wouldn't have been running away in the first place if the explosion hadn't happened. Right? If you have a heart attack because you're so startled by the MI, technically that's a quaternary issue. Okay, so anything, usually it's from fires created or chemicals released, but anything that happened because the explosion occurred, that's related to the explosion, is quaternary. It's like kind of like a coverall grab bag.
I exploded my brother.
Oh.
I threw me back like 5.
I need more details.
You got 3rd-degree burns on like 16% of the time.
The hell were y'all doing?
I mean, you know, kids are like spray paint cans in the fire and stuff like that.
In the fire?
Yeah. And then they go boom. Well, imagine that, but like a can.
That was a very wise choice.
Well, he did it. I put the can in there specifically so it would explode. Because if you don't take the plastic little spray cap off of them, they just like shoot fire out. But if you take that off, they eventually explode. But it didn't explode, so if you ran off with a 2x4, it didn't.
I don't know. I
And
read
then,
on Shannon's
all of
stuff.
us just
Your mom's probably like on medication and she's, yeah.
imagine 3 of those kids.
No.
One with 9 fingers, because that same brother I blew up in a sledgehammer.
We actually had an injury in the knee with that once where local guys were training on a non-rated pressure tank. So they had fluid in that tank. Pressure was different time, so they put air to it. And the tank exploded, the top of it literally zipped off, went through a 4-inch pipe above it. But one guy was far enough away that it busted his eardrums. And they found him just wandering, had no idea where he was. The other guy got blown away about 10 feet, smashed his head and his hips into a concrete building, broke his hip, literally took the top of his head. He was found like that. And ironically enough, there was some caustic type materials in the tank. And so that knucklehead was close enough and took us some time.
Bad day. Bad day. Everybody good with the 4 different types of blast injuries?
What was the last one again?
Ordinary. Oh, so if there is a fire that is created because the explosion occurred and you get a burn from that fire, or there are chemicals or gases released because of the explosion and you get chemical burns, or you inhale anything.
Injuries that were not directly the result of the thing exploding.
You get those injuries because the explosion happened. Does that make sense? It's not like directly from the pressure itself, it's just from what side effects happened secondary to the explosion.
Yeah, that's good.
So again, guys, just know the definition of multi-system trauma. Again, if I've got several broken bones and I have a pneumothorax, or I have a crap ton of soft tissue injuries and I've got a cardiac tamponade, or I've got all of the above and a TBI, okay? Not good for my patient. Why?
That's.
I need all those different systems to work, right? The more systems affected, the more blood I have potential for losing. My organs, become impaired. So yeah, multi-system trauma is not a good thing to have. Guys, what are we keeping in mind for these patients if they have multi-system trauma or they're a critical patient secondary to a trauma injury? So same as our critical medical patients, right? What are some? ALS, absolutely. What else? Rapid transport. So what should my ideal on-scene time be? Less than 10 minutes. Okay, sometimes that is not feasible. What if they're having to be extricated from a car, right? By the time you actually physically have access to your patient, we need to be load them up, head into the hospital in 10 minutes, ideally, right? What else am I doing? I'm calling a report and saying what?
Everything that's wrong.
Okay, so giving a full report, but what do I need to lead off with? Okay, I'm bringing a trauma alert. Okay, that needs to be once. Hey, Grady ECC raising, or Grady 123 rating Grady ECC. Once you hear that, hey, yeah, go ahead. Hey, this is Unit 123. I'm activating a trauma alert for a 20-year-old female. Blah blah blah. Okay, so that needs to be the first thing out of your head, so you get that attention of that dispatcher. Be like, oop, I really need to listen. Right? Give a detailed report. Where are we taking these patients? To a trauma center. Okay. Now guys, if it's just like a broken bone and there's nothing else wrong with them, can I take that patient to Piedmont or Northside?
Probably.
They might not be happy with me when I get there because they don't really do trauma, but is that something they can handle? Yes. You will be surprised. But if I've got an open femur fracture and a pneumothorax and a really bad head laceration, if I roll into Piedmont with that patient, A, I'm going to get cussed out. But B, what else is going to happen that's more important? That patient is not going to receive the most appropriate care, right? If it's a significant trauma patient, they need to go to a trauma facility. All right, what are the 2 level 1 trauma centers within the city of Atlanta?
Grady and Atlanta Medical.
Grady and AMC, Atlanta Medical Center. Probably. Because guys, what happens if I take a GSW like an abdomen? What if my patient got shot twice in the stomach and I take them to GSR and I take them to Piedmont? What are they going to do? They might try to do surgery, but they might not have the right surgeons on call. They don't have the experience with that. They might not even be in the hospital. Okay, so they might have a less experienced surgeon that won't do possibly as good of a job, but they're probably just going to stabilize that patient and then do what?
Transport.
Hey, I need this patient to be taken to Grady. All right, so it's detrimental to your patient for more than one reason. Okay, so yeah, AMC and Grady are the level 1 trauma centers. They can handle anything and everything. AMC is a great hospital, but they're much smaller than Grady. AMC has, at best, 3 large trauma bays that they can work patients in. And guys, they're small. All right, I used to work in the ER at AMC. If you've got 3 patients at the same time in those 3 trauma bays and all of those people that need to be in there working on those 3 patients, there's not a lot of wiggle room. There's I think at least 10 at Grady. Okay, so AMC is great. They have great capabilities, but their surface area is a lot smaller, so they can't handle a ton of those critical patients like Grady can.
So say you're right next to Piedmont, severe trauma case, and they're unlikely to make it if you try to get to Grady. To go and try and stabilize.
That's going to be a judgment call, but typically no, because what's going to be causing that hypovolemic shock or eventually cardiac arrest? What's the root cause of it? Trauma, right? So what do they need to have any chance to be able to be fixed? Surgery. Yeah, so typically, guys, you will only bypass going to a trauma center if you're up north and you're right by Northside Hospital. and you've got a trauma patient and they're like already in cardiac arrest, then I might think about going to Northside. But if I'm all the way up north in the 400 area and I've got a trauma patient and they're conscious and alert, I'm bypassing every single hospital to get them to Grady. But yeah, that's a judgment call on your end. Guys, within an hour, just like the STEMI patients, just like the stroke patients, right? Within an hour of the incident, ideally we want to have these patients at the hospital receiving that definitive care, going to the OR, getting those blood products, all that jazz, okay? So if your patient's critical, what kind of transport are they getting back to the hospital? Code 1, lights and sirens. How often are you reassessing everything?
5 minutes.
Q5. Guys, what 3 things do we reassess? ABC, LOC, right? What else? Vitals, okay, and any interventions. So what do you think, now that we're hopping into trauma, what's an intervention that we're going to do for trauma? Splints. Okay, bleeding control. Those are big ones. So how do we check those interventions? How do we make sure they're still working?
Is there blood coming out of the hole?
Is there still blood coming out, or is it bleeding controlled, right? So when we talk about interventions with trauma, we're going to go back and say, hey, I put a dressing here to control the bleeding. Is it still good? Or hey, I put this splint here so I can stabilize this bone. Is it still stabilized? Is it still like intact? Is PMS still good? Okay, and we'll get to those individually, but that's when it comes to trauma interventions. Go and make sure that they're still working, they're not bleeding. Guys, we're going to talk about all of these separately throughout this module, so we're not going to go into this right now. Who knows the difference between, because guys, there's all sorts of different levels when it comes to like a trauma facility. There's level 1, 2, 3, technically there's a 4. All right, so what's a level 3 trauma center? Just regular old stuff. What do you mean?
It wasn't number 4.
Listen. So these are the hospitals like South Fulton, right? AMC South. They have most of the equipment there. They have doctors and nurses there. They technically have an OR there, all that stuff. But they're not a high-level trauma center. They don't have all of the possible doctors you could have in-house in the hospital. They don't have a lot of the extra equipment, all right? So these are the places that if you take a critical patient, they're just gonna stabilize them and be like, ooh, we can't really do anything with these patients. We can get their vitals mostly stable, but then they're gonna call a unit and say, hey, I need you to come pick this patient up in South Fulton and take them to Grady. We can't handle them here. All right, what's a level 2? Anybody know? Because for a really long time, AMC was not a level 1 trauma center. AMC was a level 2 for a long time.
Kennestone's level 2.
Kennestone is level 2. They are very close to getting their level 1 certification. All right, so guys, level 2, they have all of the equipment. They have all of the OR capability, the CT capability, the MRI capability. But depending on what kind of different surgeon you guys need or that your patients are going to need, all of those doctors, most of them are going to be on call at a level 2 facility, meaning what? They're at home. They're not inside the hospital themselves. If they have, say, hey, you guys call in a report and say, I'm bringing, let's say level 2, Kennestone, I'm bringing you X amount of patient, we need X amount of surgeons. They'll get off the phone with you, pick up the phone and call that doctor and say, hey, we need you here at the hospital, come here immediately. So it takes them what to get there? Time. They have a certain time frame that they have to be within X amount of time from the hospital at all times, but typically that's up to an hour. Okay, so that's time that your patient's waiting to get that definitive treatment. Level 1 has all the same stuff as a level 2 facility, but where are all of those surgeons and doctors? In the hospital. All right, even if it's 4 a.m. and they've been there, that's their 24-hour shift, there are sleep rooms in the hospital. They have pagers. All right, so they say, hey, they will call the doctor, they will page the doctor and say, hey, we got trauma activation, you need to be down here in 5 minutes. And it is feasible for them to be down there in 5 minutes because they just have to get up, go to the elevator, go down the stairs, and they're like, hey, I'm already here. All right, so level 1's always best bet for your patient, but that's the main difference is level 1 has everything and everyone in-house.
Do they use a different scale? Like
A different what?
a different scale?
Probably
Because there's like one in Germany that's like one of the best trauma centers in the world, but I think they call it everyone.
It might be opposite, yeah, I don't know. We like to do things a little backwards here in America. So. Wouldn't surprise me. Okay, so there are some loopholes. All right, guys, this is more so specific to the area you're going to serve when you get a job. Okay, because here in Grady, the area of Atlanta, the state of Atlanta, we have different pediatric, just straight up hospital medical facilities, and then we have a pediatric trauma facility. Okay, so what happens if you have a patient who is 3 years old? You pick them up down on Cleveland Avenue, which is South Atlanta. You're going to bypass Grady and AMC to go all the way to Briarcliff Road to take them to Eggleston, which is the pediatric trauma center. Do we do that? If they're mostly stable? Yeah. Why? Why is it going to be the best bet for that patient to go to a pediatric trauma center? Okay, the doctors have much more experience. Like that's all they do, right? Are small bones and small vessels and small organs. Okay, little Berkey hands, right? What else is going to be better for that patient to go to a pediatric trauma center versus an adult? The equipment. It's like cute and sad at the same time, guys. If you ever, go to CHOA or anything like that, all of the itty bitty, like small patient size equipment that we normally see on adults, like the blood pressure cuffs and the pulse oxes and the bandages and the band-aids and the splints, like it's just like, it's mini. You're like, oh, it's so cute, but then you're like, no, because that means it has to go on a kid that's small and that's sick and all that stuff. So the equipment and the resources, that patient's going to be much better off at a pediatric trauma center, okay? Now, if you're transporting your patient and you're on Cleveland Avenue, you get on 75 and your patient goes into cardiac arrest, secondary to trauma, that's going to be a judgment call. Typically, we won't bypass Grady and AMC to go all the way to Eggleston. At that point, they would be better off getting that care at the trauma center that's closest versus more tuned to their body size. Hughes Spalding is not a trauma center, and they are very stern about that fact. They will only take sick patients. You can take a cardiac arrest if it's medical to Hughes Spalding, pediatric. But yeah, they don't take any kind of trauma, guys. I had a patient who, it was a little girl, she was like 4, she cut her finger on a can of tuna. Didn't need stitches, was up to date on tetanus shots. Mom was just freaking out and wanted her to go. So very minor trauma, like was not deep at all, didn't need any interventions other than maybe a Band-Aid or some like a medical super glue. So I called him and said, hey, will you guys accept this patient? No, that's trauma injury. They have to go to Eggleston. Hughes Spalding does not take like trauma in any capacity. It's across the street from Grady, but yeah, it's only medical stuff that they will accept. So, what if you have an MVC and there is a mom and a kid? Mom is more critical with her trauma injuries. Kid's fine. What do we want to do in that situation? Take the more critical patient to the more specific hospital, okay? In that capacity, we can take that 3-year-old patient with mom to Grady if it's just got minor injuries that doesn't require the pediatric patient being like going to surgery.
What about the opposite? The pediatric trauma centers usually have like enough overflow gear to handle adults online?
Because guys, do we really want to split up parents and children if we can help it. And if I've got two significantly critical mom and kid, like real bad off, yeah, mom needs to go to Grady, kid needs to go to Eggleston. But for the most part, we try to keep that together. If kid's critical and mom's just got maybe like a cut on her arm, Eggleston will take mom as a patient.
Would it be appropriate to let mom make that call?
No. Because you are trained, this is part of your knowledge and your education to make the best decision for your patient. That's not going to be going through a parent's head in that situation.
But if she's not altered or anything, she can still, I mean, isn't that like kind of like refusing care?
So
Just to put it into
paint me a
hospital.
better picture. What do you specifically?
So if the patient has like a cut, right? And
The adult, the mom.
adult, yeah.
Okay.
And the kid is like messed up.
Kid's critical.
Yeah, but she wants to go to Grady and not Eggleston.
She wants the kid to go to Grady.
Yeah.
I mean, technically, that would be where you would give an informed consent to the parent to say, hey, I can take her to Grady, but it's going to be much better off for her if they go there because of X and X and X. But yeah, that would be something I would get on the phone with supervision and say, hey, giving you a heads up, they're going to be bitching me out at Grady for bringing this patient here, but mom's adamantly refusing. So try your best to sway.
Yeah, we'll go to Grady, we're almost there, and then we just like, well, this is the wrong hospital. Might as well go inside.
Remember that from Kidnapping?
She never said, I want to get out, she said, oh, we're there.
If she gets a good lawyer, you know. Everybody give a trauma overview. I know that's a lot. There's a lot of things that go into seeing size up, MOI, index of suspicion, all that jazz. 10-minute break.